My colleagues Andrea Lavazza from Centro Universitario in Arezzo and Mirko Farina from Human-Machine Interaction Lab in Indianapolis University, they contributed equally to this talk, so the credit goes to all three of us. Okay, I briefly want to share my plan for this talk. We start by introducing the key concepts of the talk, which were already mentioned yesterday, is filter bubbles and echo chambers. We also review some of the explanations for the emergence of echo chambers. And then the second part of the talk is, will be our own contribution. We argue that these explanations may be not fully satisfactory, and we claim that the reason for the appearance of echo chambers lies in the adoption of what is called the epistemic vices. And in the last part of the talk, we will try to sketch maybe the future of how we can deal with this problem, and that is offering a responsibilist pedagogy of virtues and vices to deal with echo chambers. Filter bubbles. First is the idea that we shouldn't blame just social media. We shouldn't blame just the newspapers and media in general, but there is an epistemically important process going on, and this process consists in the idea that we are surrounded by the certain information and are excluded from certain information. And this is what is called filter bubbles. But another concept which was also introduced yesterday is the concept of echo chambers. It's different. Echo chambers is different, the phenomenon is different in the sense that while inside the echo chamber, you are not isolated from alternative information. You have access to alternative evidence, you have access to alternative points of view if you wanted to use this. But for some reason, people inside the echo chambers actively distrust alternative points of view, alternative information, and they filter in some way the incoming information, and in this sense, the result is the same as the filter bubbles in disbelief, but we think that it's a more dangerous. It's a more dangerous phenomena because if you are inside in a filter bubble, a person who is, if you introduce some alternative evidence to the person, then there is a chance, that's not completely, it's not guaranteed, but there is a chance that a person be persuaded. But if you're inside an echo chamber, even if you introduce evidence, if you show the evidence, for example, refer them to scientific experts in the field, nothing. There's almost nothing can persuade a person inside an echo chamber. Yes, and a familiar example is a QAnon conspiracy. Any kind of conspiracy would be a prime example of this kind of intellectual behavior. I have my own, because everybody knows, of course, QAnon, but I just have my own, I just want to share my own experience. I have a colleague, a professor, who is a vaccine denier, so to say. And interesting fact about her is that she actually had a COVID disease, and it was like very severe. So she was in not in intensive therapy, but she had very severe symptoms. She had to stay several weeks in the hospital, and even after that, even after she came back, she was still, and up to now, she is still a denier of vaccination. So even firsthand, personal experience should do something, but it doesn't. Yes, and of course, epistemologists ask what's going on. Yes, what's going on? Why people are behaving like that? So of course, there are different explanations offered in this to this problem. One of them was mentioned yesterday also as a motivated reasoning, of course, is the idea that we are, of course, as a product of evolution, and there's some cognitive mechanisms. One of them is motivated reasoning, a tendency to find arguments in favor of conclusions we want to believe to be stronger than the arguments for conclusions we do not want to believe. So if we desire something to be true, and we tend to favor the arguments for this position. If the arguments a different position are met with resistance. Yes, it's true. And it's a very powerful mechanism, of course. And there is another mechanism which was also mentioned yesterday. It's in-group, out-group attitudes. Yes, we favor our groups. We tend to distrust the members which are not filling into our groups. It is true, but some writers question maybe if it's not the sole problem, the sole solution to the problem. And for example, some authors, researchers point to the fact that analytic thinking plays a hugely important role in people's self-inoculation against disinformation. It's not just desires. And there is some empirical evidence that people fall for fake news because they fail to think, not because they think in a motivated or identity protective way. Just refer to this criticism. Okay, another solution maybe it's just lower IQ, lower education, yes? And there's some research to prove that, especially Khan showed that they've found a correlation between how people perform on an ordinary science intelligence scale and on how do they accept the fake news. They found a significant correlation. However, again, we accept that this is a problem, like more education, like better education, of course, will have a better impact on this problem. However, this wouldn't necessarily explain why some of the highly intelligent people, including my colleague who is a PhD, which I mentioned, yes, persist in believing false theories. And we know even some Nobel Prize winners like Luc Montagnier and Watson have been promoting some kind of a conspiracy or racist theories and so on. Let's explore another approach. This approach comes within what is called a responsibilist virtue epistemology. Virtue epistemology is a branch, a movement within epistemology, which have been actively developing within these last years. And the concept, the key concept is the responsibility, of course, as in the name, that a person's intellectual behavior should be responsible. And the responsibility comes for what? Yes, the responsibility for choosing actively. That's why I asked the question yesterday to one of the keynote speakers. How can we be responsible, yes, or should we be responsible for our beliefs? The responsibilist approach says first that we are responsible for our beliefs, and the second is that the idea of responsibility comes from our intellectual character for which we are responsible. So we are responsible for building our intellectual character. Therefore, ultimately, we are responsible for our actions and decisions, just as we are responsible for building our moral character. Therefore, we are responsible for our moral actions and decisions. And of course, some of the key authors in this field are Zagzebski, Bartley, and Kassam. So as I said, the key concept here is virtue and vice, but in the concept of this talk, I would like to more concentrate more fully on the concept of epistemic vice. So just as in ethics, there is a parallel between like virtues and vices, so good and bad moral character traits. There is good and bad intellectual character traits. Actively, we started to see the research going on and advice on intellectual vices from the influential book by Kasim Kassam in 2019, and onwards now there is a volume in vice epistemology, and there is ongoing research on what first is on definition of what is vice, intellectual vice especially in this context, in the context of epistemology, and how we can overcome this, yes. And these are some of the examples of intellectual vices. Something which unites these examples, like dogmatism, intellectual sloppiness, intellectual snobism, epistemic injustice, and gullibility, as just some of the examples, is that epistemically they prevent us from acquiring what is called the epistemic goods, epistemic values, such as truth, justification, knowledge, understanding, and so on. Yes. So this, if a person has this, there is like a lower chance that he will acquire a relevant intellectual value, a relevant intellectual good in a certain sphere. Okay. There is some empirical, I just want to point you to some empirical results which have shown that there is a high correlation between people who demonstrate epistemic vice and people who believe misinformation about COVID-19. This is a paper published in 2021 by Mayer and other authors, and they've constructed two types of questionnaires, one for measuring intellectual vice and another for measuring people's belief in COVID misinformation. In intellectual vice, they mostly used two scales, and that is rigidity, which is people's inability to change their views, and intellectual laziness, so that's just intellectual indifference. That just people are indifferent to new knowledge, new information. And they tried to correlate this with people's reactions to certain misinformation about COVID-19. For example, they were presented with such questions. Do you believe that 5G causes people to transmit COVID? Or do you believe that flies carry COVID, flies can carry COVID, or other misinformation? And of course, they include some true statements like, for example, elderly people are more prone to have severe effects from COVID and so on. And they found out, as you see in the chart, there is quite a high correlation between people who score high on this, this upper right corner with intellectual vices such as closed-mindedness, sloppiness, obstinacy, apathy, and diffidence, and those who believe misinformation about COVID. Of course, I admit this is correlation, not causation, and you have to be aware. But anyway, we are in the beginning of the process. I hope there will be more empirical research on this. In the focus of the talk, I think it is important to speak about one particular vice, which I think is largely responsible, intellectual vice, largely responsible for people actively persisting inside an echo chamber. By the way, I wanted to make a disclaimer. Yes, there was a discussion in what sense we should employ the concept of echo chambers, of course. And yes, in a broad sense, we are all inside an echo chamber. Like, for example, we all share the belief that the earth is round and actively distrust anyone who would say that the earth is flat. I admit so, but we should use, I think, this concept of echo chamber in a more restricted sense. And in that sense, of course, we claim that not all people are inside an echo chamber, but some people are. And instead, you can be like, we claim you can get inside an echo chamber, but there is a chance you can get out willingly if you realize that something's wrong, something with your intellectual environment is wrong. something with your news feed is wrong. And it's possible, even if you get in, you get out. So what vice, in our view, is particularly responsible, and this vice is what's called epistemic violence. It was first used in reference to someone's, let's say, an active distrust to evidence. Initially, it was in reference to minorities, such as, for example, the evidence coming from black women in USA, or people who are sexual minorities, and the idea that in general there is a tendency to distrust, to not take into account, not put the same weight to the evidence which is presented by these underprivileged groups in the society. Of course, we fully support this idea that it's absolutely true, and there is the work in epistemic injustice, which is related to this problem, which is propagated by Fricker, of course. But we want to apply this, and we think that the same thing is actually let's suppose that maybe the same thing is going on inside an echo chamber, because what we are doing, we are actively distrusting, we are basically negating the experience, the evidence of our peers outside this echo chamber, who are, in all other respects, are our intellectual peers, even experts, not even intellectual peers, but even experts who should have high expertise than us. We ignore, we distrust, we silence their view in favor of the views which are circulating inside of the echo chamber. Is there any new dimension which is brought by the pandemic in this process? We say there is. And actually, we suggest that these processes of people's polarizing, having these irrational beliefs, was intensified during COVID-19 pandemic. So what happened, especially at the beginning of pandemic, is that this is a kind of a new phenomenon which we were not before. The experts especially were not ready. There was, initially at least, there was many disagreements between experts on the key issues, and the traditional way of acquiring information for the layperson, which is a deference to the opinion of experts, didn't work. People asking questions, the experts having different opinions. The paradigmatic example here is, as presented in our colleague's paper, is the allocation of ventilators during this early period of pandemic, where there is advice from the experts initially to use some protocols which would disadvantage people with mental illnesses with the access to these ventilators. So what happened here is that, of course, this was a very questionable advice, and in our view, the policy, again, to voice my opinion on this question, which was discussed earlier about the relation between the government and the experts. Of course, the experts, they have a role, a duty actually to advise, but they are not the decision makers. That's the main difference. Yes, they are advising, they are of course responsible for the advice that they give. And in this case, there was riots and demonstrations against this law, and it was against this rule, and it was quickly abandoned. But in general, we see that there is, there was initially at least a disagreement between experts globally. Should we enforce lockdowns? To what degree should we enforce lockdowns? Should there be mandatory vaccination or not? There is the Scandinavian countries' experience on this. Another question is, should there be obligatory vaccination for example, like in some countries. This also created the division among experts, and this is breaks one of the key criterion for deference to the expert opinion, which is the consensus of the experts. And during this pandemic, COVID pandemic, we have seen many cases where there was no universal, let's say, the type of consensus we have, for example, for such beliefs as that there is AIDS, the earth is round, and so on. There was like controversy. So what can we do? There were several measures proposed. One way is to deal with this kind of environment, political environment, epistemic environment, mostly, by some state-level measures, community-level measures. So we introduce different ways how we can deal with this called epistemic polluters, such as blocking, banning, fact-checking, like placing tags, fake news, as in Twitter they do. Does this stop people from, for example, blocking Trump's Twitter? Does it stop people who follow Trump on Twitter believing Trump? Likely not, yes? And this is one problem. Another problem is that these measures may be considered controversial, and especially if it's implemented on the level of legislation, yes. So what I want to propose is that probably we can at least work with our narrow epistemic environments, yes? Narrow epistemic environments is the environment which we choose ourselves, like what public resources we subscribe to, which media we watch, and so on. And we cannot say that this is a responsibility of the government, this is a responsibility of the community. This is also shared, by myself, my responsibility. And this is the key concept, that being responsible, according to Code, means being motivated to form beliefs in a virtuous manner. So responsibility, coming back to the idea of virtues, if I'm responsible for my epistemic environment, means for me to be virtuous, yes, and not use controversial epistemic practices such as quieting and smothering. Of course, we admit that there are certain circumstances which are beyond person's control, for which people cannot be morally brave, especially if they don't have access to alternative sources of information. But surely the individual responsibility, I think, maybe has here the primary, if not the central role. And one of the last slides, as with moral vices, changing the epistemic environment in this way, because it is a kind of subjective realm, yes, there's no quick way to do it. We just kind of force some rule and people become switch, and people become intellectually virtuous. So it revolves around the pedagogy of intellectual virtues. I will not focus much on this. There is a paper which is forthcoming by Pritchard about it. Of course, we mentioned that we should avoid any coercive strategy. And the last slide is a caution tape. Yes, the caution tape here is on purpose because, of course, we realize that blaming, even epistemically blaming, people for vices may be the result of partisanship. So it is, there's some research by Kassam as people which have opposite political views, they tend to call the other party not just wrong but stupid and other intellectually denigrating names and qualities.